my first night in prison was the worst night of my life. I mean, I'll never forget it because it was it was right around my birthday, a time that you're supposed to be celebrating and being happy. And I was, on my way to doing a life sentence in prison. And it was the most depressing, the most just worst imaginable experience that one could ever have. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. I was really desperate. I was so fearful. I was afraid. I was scared. I mean, I didn't know how I was just going to be able to make it through it all, and it still hadn't completely sunk in, that I was, facing a life sentence. I was so overwhelmed with fear, and sadness. I felt alone. I felt, like I was just trapped. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. You can't go crying to mom and dad or whatever. Mom and dad can't help you. There's nobody that can help you. And the only person that can help you is you. And I just felt, just like I said, overwhelmed with fear and just backed up in a corner basically and just trapped. That was a moment in my life that I faced a lot of scary moments, but that was by far the scariest moment of my life.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. Kenyatta, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, it's really, really cool to have you here. I came across your story by way of our mutual friend, Chris Redlitz, and he had told me a little bit about what you were up to. And when he said that you had spent 19 years in prison, I thought, okay, there's got to be an amazing story here that we really have to dig into. But before we get into all that, I want to start with something that I found has been very informative. This was a question that actually came from one of my partners who said, why don't you start the show with this question? So I want to start by asking, when you were a kid, what is it that you wanted to be when you grew up, and how did that influence the choices that you ended up making later on down the road?
When I was a kid, I really wanted to be a football player. I wanted to play for the Oakland Raiders. I wanted to be a quarterback. I wanted to, throw touchdowns for a living. But, as I grew, a little older, I fell into this mindset ultimately that, that I couldn't do it. I wasn't fast enough. I wasn't big enough. I wasn't strong enough. There was all these different, and I was looking more at what I didn't have and couldn't do, as opposed to what I did have and I could do at the time. And that really, that was, one of the hugest hurdles that I've had to get over in life, to propel me forward, is just to be able to focus on what I do have and what I can do. And so, as a young person, I had aspirations of being an NFL quarterback. Obviously it didn't pan out, but yeah.
So as somebody who has dealt with, really sort of dark periods in which, a tremendous amount of hope was required, which, like I said, we'll get into all of that. When people are excessively focused on what it is that they can't do or what they don't have, I mean, based on your experience, how do they shift that focus?
I think you have to get to a point in your life when, you have to ask for help, and for me, that was a huge part of it for me. I mean, I had to learn how to ask for help to figure out how to do something. And I think, asking for help and receiving it and figuring out solutions to problems really, helps you shift that focus and that mentality. At least it did for me. I don't know about other people, but it really did for me. And it really opened up my mind to a world of possibilities of what I did have and what I could do, as opposed to what I didn't have and couldn't do.
So walk me through how you go from the desire to be an NFL football player to ending up in prison for 19 years? Like, what ultimately led you down that trajectory?
I think for myself, growing up, um, I grew up without my father. My father divorced my mother when I was 6 months old, and I didn't really understand the impact that my father leaving our family had on me and my brothers until I really started doing this introspective work when I was in prison. Um, but as a kid, you have dreams and aspirations of doing all kinds of things. Um, and then when you're faced with, you have these traumatic events that happen in your life, and then it kind of stagnates your growth and your development. And, without being able to having a process in place to kind of deal with that trauma, then this unresolved trauma comes out in different kinds of ways. And for me, having the traumatic experience of my father leaving me and my mom and my two brothers when I was young, and always having this deep seated feeling of wanting him to come back and not being able to get him to come back because my father left. He never, sent me a Christmas card, never got a phone call from him. I don't even remember the sound of his voice. To have this deep need for my father to be there, and then to feel helpless because I couldn't get him to come back, it made me start thinking that maybe something was wrong with me, maybe something was wrong with my mother or my brothers. There was something wrong with us that made him not want to come back. And so I grew up having this growing feeling that I was lacking something, that there was something wrong with me, and growing up as a little kid with that and not understanding how to process that, not understanding how to articulate that to somebody else, was really difficult, and that mindset, as it continued to grow into my teens, I lost track of the goals and the aspirations that I was really, that I wanted to achieve in life, like being a quarterback. I mean, those things fell to the wayside because I was so consumed with trying to find something to fill this void in my life that I had. And as I grew up, this void grew bigger and bigger, and I was trying to find other ways outside of myself to fill this void. And so, I felt, less than. I felt like something was wrong with me, and so I was trying to find ways to fill that void in my life. I was seeking external things to fill this internal void, so to speak. And so I started, hanging around this wrong crowd, drifted further and further away from sports, and drifted more and more and more towards this group of people that I thought, would make me feel better about myself, where I could feel like I was somebody. And, it just led me down this path of making one bad choice after another, after another, after another. And I eventually, the kind of choices that I was making, it really only leads to two places, and that's either prison or 6 feet under the ground in a coffin. And, by the grace of God, I was able to wind up in prison instead of dying. So I know that's a pretty lengthy answer, and there's still, there's a lot more that I could talk about there. There was just so much that I went through as a young person that took me away from those dreams and aspirations that you asked about in your question. So
what was the first of those choices, and what was the one that ultimately landed you in prison? And I'm just curious, during the entire process, you clearly had an awareness that these choices could only lead to one of two places, which is prison or death. And yet you continued making them. So I'm curious, what your sort of mindset during that period was like.
Well, I mean, I didn't really understand that that's where it was taking me. At the time, I thought that these decisions and choices that I was making were just making me cool. They were helping me build a reputation where people, would accept me, for who for who they would just accept me. But I mean, I didn't understand that the choices that at the time, I didn't understand that the choices that I was making would lead me to prison or death. It's only in retrospect that I look back at it and I can see that now. At the time, I was just consumed with being accepted by this group that I was trying to hang out with and be cool. Does that answer your question?
It does. I'm curious, one, what were the choices, and also what happened to the people within that group, and throughout your life, like what role have they played later on in your life?
Right. So the one of the main, I would say that probably the most one of the most impactful choices that I made back then was when I started smoking pot. When I started smoking pot, I started skipping school and then eventually dropped out of school, which was another huge decision that I made that took me in the wrong path, down the wrong path. So between starting to use drugs, smoking pot, and hanging out with this wrong crowd, and then ditching school, and then getting to the point where I thought that school was not important. I mean, when my hanging out with this group of people became more important than going to school, that was a huge turning point for me. It really, once I stopped going to school completely, it just opened up, a whole. I just had more time to make more bad decisions, basically. And a lot of the choices and decisions, I went from using drugs and smoking weed every day to starting to sell drugs, and went from, selling marijuana to selling cocaine and mushrooms and acid and these kind of things as a young person, to experimenting with all that stuff. It just one bad decision after another that led me down the path to prison. But that's where it all started at.
And what about the people that you were surrounded with? What happened to them, and what role have they played in your life ongoing since then?
That's a great question. Some of them are dead. Some of them are in prison, and others completely abandoned that lifestyle altogether and are, school teachers and family people right now. So like I said, I had people that were part of my life back then that aren't with us anymore, that died for whatever reason, and other friends that went to prison like I did, that are still in prison serving time, or in and out of prison, or maybe have done time and then got out and are in a personal prison. They might not be in jail, but they're still inside a personal prison, even though they're on the outside. And friends that that recognized early on, that had mentors or family members or parents that really got through to them, and they started making different choices and are never went to jail and never made the mistakes that I'd made, but have actually started families and are positive people in the community today.
So, as somebody who sold drugs and actually spent time in our correctional system, I'm just curious, what are your views on things like the legalization of marijuana now that you've come out of this system?
I have mixed feelings about that, because I feel like on one hand, the war on drugs was just another tool that was used to incarcerate a ton of people, especially Black and brown people. There you have people that are, serving life sentences still under these mandatory minimums, federal mandatory minimums for, possession, sale of marijuana. And now you have, people that are making money off it legally right now. And so that doesn't sit well for me. I think that, drugs have a huge impact on kids' lives. And so I think that, the more that they're around and easily accessible, I think that, a lot of kids could wind up like I did. And so, I don't necessarily agree with the legalization of marijuana. And I definitely don't agree with these mandatory minimum laws that they have out there for, people that are serving these, crazy sentences for, possession of a drug that people are walking around using freely now in certain states. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in that regard, and I definitely have mixed emotions about it.
You know, you said earlier that because of the grace of God, you ended up in prison rather than dying. And, I think that's a really sort of interesting statement because there are a lot of things that I'm not scared of. I think, to me, nothing sounds more terrifying than the prospect of going to prison. Like, I told a friend once, I think death sounds less terrifying to me. So, I mean, in a moment when you realize that you're about to spend this much time in prison, I mean, what goes through your mind in a moment like that? And how is it not just the most terrifying thing in the world? And how do you find hope in a moment like that when, your whole life suddenly disappears before your eyes, which I realize is a big question.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that, both of those alternatives are like, they're at the end of the line. I mean, it's, for me, when I found myself, I never, imagined myself being in prison. It wasn't something that, I ever imagined for myself or ever thought about happening. Well, once I found myself there, I never thought that I could make it through a life sentence or that I was the kind of person that could just make it through prison. But once I found myself there, especially with a life sentence, it was like, I had, two simple choices, either sink or swim, and at the time I made a choice to swim, but it wasn't something that I did consciously. It was like, it was all about survival, really. When your back is against the wall, you have to make, tough choices. And for me, it wasn't even something that I thought about. I just responded to the situation in the only way that I knew how. And that was to fight for my life, today, back then, it was all about survival. But today, I mean, I look at it and I see, my choice to really fight for my life as really a testament to the, to the human spirit, to the resiliency that we have. I mean, even if we're facing a situation like that, I mean, we all have this, inherent quality in us that will fight, self-preservation, to survive. And, once I started doing that, I mean, trying to survive in prison, then I started taking a look around and seeing what was going on around me. And I saw other people who had, who had endured long periods of time. And I thought, heck, if they can do it, then I can do it too. There's got to be something in here that could, help me do that. And, I think a huge part of it for me too, a motivating factor for me was that, I didn't want to die in prison, man. I mean, I didn't want my legacy to be one of a thief or a convict or a prisoner. I really wanted to do something different with my life. I just didn't want to spend the rest of my life in prison. And, so I just started seeking out different ways to make it. And I just wanted to get out. I never wanted to spend the rest of my life in prison. I wasn't content with just playing cards all day and just accepting the fact that my life was just going to end inside prison. I just didn't want to go out like that. And so once I just made up my mind to start, moving towards that light at the end of the tunnel, and I saw that, I never lost sight of that, even though with a life sentence, I didn't know when I was going to get out. But, once I saw that light at the end of the tunnel, that just became my guiding light, so to speak. And I just started doing everything that I could to achieve my goal of getting out one day. And it was really, really, it was a tough thing. I mean, being in prison is a really violent place. It's a really desperate place. It's everything that you see on TV and so much more. There's so much more to it. One of the things that really helped me maintain hope and my maintain sight of that light at the end of the tunnel was, I used to do these like exercises every day first unconsciously, and then I started, really focusing in on doing it. But it was, this. I used to just envision myself every day at count time. They have this thing called count every day inside prison where they count every single person. And in California, it's at 4 o'clock. It's a mandatory count where every single prison counts every single prisoner, and all these numbers are sent to some place in Sacramento, and they confirm that everybody's where they're supposed to be inside. And during count time, I used to lay on my bunk or be wherever I was at, and just close my eyes and envision myself leaving prison. I used to envision myself, interacting in the world and being, a good person, the person that I wanted to be. I used to envision that all the time, and every single day, that exercise, it would take me away. It would take me away from where I was at, but it was something that really helped me shape and change the mindset that I had when I entered prison. At the time when I entered prison, the only thing that I could see were the things that were going wrong and what I didn't have. And so, in order to change that, I started really thinking about how I wanted my life to be. And, over the years, that mindset, doing that, it helped me, develop a mindset that transcended not only the prison walls, but, the walls that I had created in my own mind.
There is just so many questions. So my perception of prison obviously has been shaped entirely by media and movies and things like Shawshank Redemption. So I have to ask this question just out of pure morbid curiosity. Do you remember the very first night? And can you tell me what it was like?
Oh, wow. I mean, my first night in prison was the worst night of my life. I mean, I'll never forget it because it was it was right around my birthday, a time that you're supposed to be celebrating and being happy. And I was, on my way to doing a life sentence in prison. And it was the most depressing, the most just worst imaginable experience that one could ever have. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. I was really desperate. I was so fearful. I was afraid. I was scared. I mean, I didn't know how I was just going to be able to make it through it all, and it still hadn't completely sunk in, that I was, facing a life sentence. I was so overwhelmed with fear, and sadness. I felt alone. I felt, like I was just trapped. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. You can't go crying to mom and dad or whatever. Mom and dad can't help you. There's nobody that can help you. And the only person that can help you is you. And I just felt, just like I said, overwhelmed with fear and just backed up in a corner basically and just trapped. That was a moment in my life that, I faced a lot of scary moments, but that was by far the scariest moment of my life. And I could easily see how some people would begin to even think about maybe even taking their life, being faced with that kind of situation. For me, it was really, really hard. Most difficult day of my life. I remember getting to this place called R.J. Donovan. It's the reception center for all of the for the people that are going into the California prison system from San Diego County and the neighboring Orange County, I believe. They get sent to a reception center called R.J. Donovan, and it's in eastern part of southern San Diego County. And the first day that I got there, I mean, I was trying to keep a stiff upper lip around my homeboys or whatever, but inside I was petrified. And I remember getting put in the cell that they put me in, and then having the door slam behind me from the first time, and sitting on that bunk and thinking about how much time I had to do. I mean, I wasn't just going to be in there for a couple months or maybe a year or two. This was like an indeterminate life sentence. they call it the end of the line in prison. I mean, that's it. There's only one more place you can go, and that's on death row. And thank God I didn't get there. But having a life sentence and being as young as I was, and really as inexperienced as I was with prison, I mean, it was really, really, really scary. I mean, I wish that I could. And I wrote a piece about it. It's on Quora, that really probably gives a better description of what I described right now. But it was just thinking about it right now. It just put chills on my arm just thinking about it, and I'm just so thankful that I'm not there anymore. But I met a lot of people while I was going through that period of time right there, leading up to my first day, and then after that first day, a lot of people that were experiencing the same thing. I remember this one guy that I talked to, and this guy ended up getting victimized really bad because he showed, his true emotion at the time. There were guys this guy actually just came down to the day room and just started crying, in front of everybody. And there were people who saw him start crying and that eventually, preyed on that weakness or, his vulnerability. I won't say weakness, but vulnerability. And, ended up, taking this guy and just, really just abusing him to the point where, and I never saw him again. He tried to commit suicide. I never saw him again, but really horrible experience. And, seeing that, really let me know that, hey, this is the kind of environment where you really can't show how you feel. So just imagine having all that fear inside of you, but not having anyone to talk to about it. And every time that you come to the yard, I mean, you have to have like a good poker face, a stone face. You can't come out to the yard and start breaking down crying. You can't do that. So just imagine having all this going on inside of you and having to keep it in. No one to talk to, no one to really share how you're feeling. That made it even 10 times harder.
So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable. I guess the next question that I have is, how do you find some semblance of a meaningful life knowing that you're going to be in there? Like, I mean, I'm guessing during this time you've probably made friends. I am just so curious, one, how do you find some semblance of a meaningful life? Two, I mean, I think for us, at least those of us listening, what we've seen are things that you've described, like excessive violence, which that to me, I think is the most terrifying thing because I'm a small dude. I feel like I would get killed within a few days. Somebody would just beat the shit out of me and it would be over. That to me, I think is the thing I'd fear the most. But the bigger question is, how do you find semblance of a meaningful life? And then, what is a typical day like? What do we not know about the typical day of somebody who is in a situation like the one that you're in?
Well, in prison, you really have a lot of time to think, think about not only the crimes that you committed, but your life. I was facing a life sentence. I was 25 years old at the time. For probably the first 5 or 6 years, I was in really deep denial about the role that I played in getting myself there. But once I got through that denial, then it was really all about taking accountability and responsibility for what I had done. And then when I started thinking about, the victims that I created, you know, I've always felt like I'm a good person. I didn't show it all the time with my actions. Um, but once I got to that point where I accepted, the harm that I had created in my community and the victims that I created with the crimes that I committed, then became all about how do I make amends? Even if I never get out of prison, I want people to know, at least in here in the community that I live in, that I was a changed person. So I started just seeking out different ways that I could add value to my community and make amends by helping other people so that they could potentially turn their lives around and not commit more crimes and not create more victims. Because the reality of it is I couldn't go back and put the gun back in my pocket and, take away the robbery that I committed. I couldn't do that. Those people were traumatized for the rest of their life by the crime that I committed against them. What I could do, though, was do the work on myself to ensure that A, I never commit a crime like that again, and B, take what I've learned and help other people so that they don't go out and commit those crimes, And so I found peace in that. I found freedom in that. I found even inside prison, if I never would have gotten out of prison, I knew in my heart of hearts that I was a changed man. And so I lived that out every day on the prison yard. And, that's what helped me. That's what helped keep me moving forward, is because I knew that I had changed, and I knew that that the work that I was doing was helping other people as well. And so that's the first part of your question. The second part was, I'm sorry.
Second part was, what is a typical day in the life of a San Quentin inmate like? Like, what are the things that we don't know? Because, like I said, I think all we get exposed to is sort of the violence and, what we see on TV shows like Lockup.
Right. Well, I can tell you right now that there is a really, really large percent of the population at San Quentin that are engaged in that same process that I just described to you. So many of those guys there are doing the work that's necessary. They're not in prison just to get out. They're actually in there working on themselves, taking college courses, getting educated, becoming new people, so that when they do get released, they're able to be, assets to themselves and their families and their community, as opposed to being a detriment to the community. I personally know hundreds of guys that are at San Quentin right now that are involved in all the same programs that I took that helped me turn my life around. So a typical day for me, what it looked like, I would get up in the morning and, get ready for breakfast. I'd, leave my cell in the morning, and I had a job as a peer health educator. And I worked with and helped facilitate a bunch of programs at San Quentin that helped me stay out of the cell pretty much all day. And so once I left the cell in the morning, I wouldn't get back until like almost 9 o'clock at night, because I'd be involved in so many programs. And so the first program would start after I left the chow hall. So I'd get up early in the morning, leave my cell, go to breakfast. I would see many of the other guys that I was working with, some of my mentors, talk to them about maybe a problem or something that I was having, or something that we'd be working on later on in the day or the week. And we discuss these things over prison cuisine at the little tables that they have in there. And, then we leave the chow hall. I would go down to the lower yard where they have a big yard down there where people can, exercise and that sort of thing. And so I would go and I would walk some laps, usually with a friend of mine that I worked with. And we would discuss, the different programs that we were going to, the different parts of the program that we were going to facilitate for the day. So he and I would kind of have a check-in, and we'd walk a couple laps and talk about that. And then I would get some exercise in. I was, big on exercise on the inside. So, I would do pull-ups and dips and push-ups and, run laps and that sort of thing. And then go back to my cell, kind of clean up, and then go down to work. My job started at 9 a.m. So by the time 9 a.m. came around, I had already accomplished a lot of things. And that was something that was really big for me too, that helped me keep hope alive too, was that I was actually doing things that were productive. You know, I think for a long time, I felt guilty about, not living up to my potential, in life. And so every single day, I had tasks that I would want to complete. And, exercise was a huge part of that, keeping me focused. And so I would do all those things before 9 o'clock. And once 9 o'clock came, I would report to my job. And my job at San Quentin was a peer health educator. And so I used to work for an organization called Centerforce. And Centerforce was a services provider at San Quentin. They're a nonprofit organization that really focuses on bringing families together and focusing on health and wellness. And one of the programs that I got involved in with them was their peer health education program. And peer health was really designed to help us as individuals learn more about our health and what we could do to stay healthy on the inside. And then it was like a peer-led program where other guys that were inside with you would teach you this stuff. And then the idea was each one teach one. So I could be a peer health educator and just walk around the yard, and, if health issues came up. I mean, for example, there were a lot of questions about HIV and how HIV was passed around. And what the peer health education program helped do was debunk a lot of the myths that were out about how these viruses and diseases were transmitted between one another. And so the peer health education program helped, provide a lot of answers to these questions. And so I went through the initial training, and then I actually got offered a job to be an official peer health educator on the yard. And so we used to facilitate this program where guys would sign up for these health education classes, and they would come down. And one of my responsibilities was facilitating and teaching these classes to help guys learn more about their health and connect them to health resources once they got out of prison. And so we used to give these presentations about hepatitis. Inside prison, tattooing and intravenous drug use is kind of prevalent. And so, one of the things that, and the prison has a position of abstinence. They say, don't use drugs. That's just their approach. Don't use drugs. Don't do this. Don't do that. But the reality of it is that people do use drugs. And if people are going to use drugs, then how can we help them, not spread HIV or hepatitis C inside prison? And so one of the things that we used to do was take these guys through a curriculum and a course that would help them understand how to be safe. Instead of saying don't have sex, how to have safe sex. Instead of saying don't use drugs, how can you use drugs in a way that doesn't spread HIV or hepatitis C? And so we would take them through these different steps of, how to be safe and how to eventually get off drugs if that's something that they were ready to do. So I would facilitate these classes from 9 o'clock in the morning till about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then, once I got off work, I normally would report to another program that I was involved in. One of the programs being the Last Mile. Another program that I was involved in was the Prison University Project. I was in college. They have college courses there. So I would report to, whatever class I had that day, report to that. And then 4 o'clock would come around and I'd go back to my cell and do my meditation and visualization practices that I would do there. Then at about 5 o'clock, count would clear normally right around that time. And then I would go to dinner. They would have chow. So sometimes I would go to the chow hall. Sometimes I would just make food in the cell and eat food there. And then around 6 o'clock, I would report to more classes. And so they would have college classes at night. The last mile was at night, so I would go to the last mile um, and do that from 6 until about 8:45, where I had to go back to my cell for another count. And then that's when they would have lockup. That's when everybody would report to their cells at around 9, and it would be lights out. And, I would normally just watch the news, watch what was going on. One of the things that, that most prisoners feel is this really deep-seated desire to stay connected to the outside world in some form or fashion. And, probably the most popular way that people do that is through television. And so we're allowed to buy televisions on the inside. If you have someone that can afford to send you some money to buy a TV, then you buy the TV through this package program that they have there. You receive a package that has a TV in it. You set it up in your cell, and then you have TV there. And so one of the things that I would do at night would be to watch the news, catch up on current events, politics, what was going on in the Bay Area. Since I was in San Quentin, we got local news channels there, so we would stay up on the latest current events that were happening. And then around 10:30 or so, 10:30, 11, I would go to sleep, and that would be it. Next day, I'd wake up and do it all over again.
So I have one other question about this, and this is specifically about sort of the violence that we tend to see on TV and all the things. How do you avoid that? Like, that to me, I think is the thing that I would fear most about it. And I'm curious, how is it? It seemed to me like I'd always felt like it was one of the, prison was one of those places where you don't have to look for trouble; it finds you.
In a lot of ways, yes. And I think that there are things that you can do while you're on the inside prison that can help you stay safe and help you avoid violence. Most of the violence that's in there is directed at people who violate some kind of code in there or do something that raises the ire of the people that are around you. When I entered the prison system, I was given by other people around me a set of ethics and a code, so to speak. There's rules inside prison, and if you stick to the rules, then you can pretty much avoid violence. Sometimes there's riots. Sometimes there's stuff that happens that's outside of your control that puts you in harm's way, whether you like it or not. Prison is a very racially charged environment. And so if you're black, then you stick with blacks. If you're white, you stick with whites. If you're Hispanic, you stick with your group. For the most part, I think that, so here's a couple of the rules that I stuck to that helped pretty much keep me safe the time that I was there. The first one is mind your own business. You see stuff happening all the time in prison. The main thing is just to keep your mouth shut. You don't talk about other people's business. You don't talk to the cops. That's another rule about what you've seen. And so I can recall being on the yard and seeing people get stabbed for, various reasons. And even though you see that kind of stuff, you turn and you look the other way, you walk the other way. You don't want to get involved in things that don't pertain to you. And so you mind your own business. That's rule number one. That'll help keep you safe. And you don't talk to the cops. I mentioned that just a second ago. If one of the cops, identified you as being somebody who might have known something, when they sit down to interrogate you, there's a simple statement that you make. And for me, it was, I wasn't there, I didn't see anything, and I don't know anything. And that's it. I didn't see anything, I wasn't there, and I don't know nothing. And if you stick to that, then you're okay. The minute that you start providing information to the cops about anything, then you put yourself in a situation where that's probably most dangerous. That's probably the easiest way to to have violence come upon you is by telling, by snitching, by providing information to the authorities, so to speak, inside. Being labeled a snitch is probably the worst thing that you can be on the inside in prison, and that'll bring violence your way really fast. So those two things, along with a couple other rules like not getting in debt. The first person that I ever saw get stabbed in prison was a chronic gambler, and he would, get involved in card games and dice games, and end up owing a bunch of people money. And owing people money inside will get you hurt really fast. So I didn't. I minded my own business. I never talked to the cops, and I never got caught up in any kind of gambling or any other kind of illegal activity inside prison that could put me in debt. Being in debt inside prison, that's a surefire way to get you hurt. And so I didn't do any of those things. And when I was confronted with violence, there were certain situations where maybe I would get into an argument with somebody on the basketball court or something like that, and you have to fight. It's just that simple, and you have to not be afraid to use a weapon if need be, because inside prison, there's very few fist fights. A lot of times weapons are pulled, and you have to be willing to do that. And if you're not, then you won't last very long. And so having that kind of mentality is something that keeps people alive inside prison. It's not something that you want to bring to the outside world, but while you're in there, it's something that'll keep you standing on both feet for as long as you need to.
So you mentioned that you had been exposed to people who served really lengthy sentences and people who were serving life sentences or endured incredibly long sentences. And I'm curious what you learned from them about persistence, hope, and grit.
I learned a lot from a lot of different guys that are still serving time inside, that had endured race riots, that endured the toughest yards and prisons that you could ever imagine. And a lot of those guys are filled with, the kind of wisdom that will keep you, alive in prison. And so, I tried to learn as much as I could. Those rules the couple of the rules that I just shared with you right now, those were given to me by guys that had been around, that were veterans, so to speak, on the inside. And, it's that kind of wisdom that you take to heart. If it worked for them, then, my reasoning was it could work for me as well. And it did. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Talk to me about the day you got out. Tell me about the transition from life on the inside to life on the outside, specifically the very first day.
Best day of my life, by far. I've never experienced anything that felt better than me walking out of prison after serving a life sentence. Nothing compares. Nothing comes close. I can't even put words together to describe the feeling. But if there was one word that I could use to describe it, it would just be joy. The most incredible sense of joy that I've ever felt. I had been in prison for a couple days short of 19 years. And, being in prison with a life sentence, obviously, to navigate your way around the landscape of an incarcerated setting is very difficult. Doing that from, through the lens of having a life sentence is twice as difficult because, let's face it, when you're in prison with a life sentence, there's this uncertainty, that you'll never get out. And that in itself is very, very daunting. And so, for me, it was the daily stress that you have to endure in there. You have to really dig deep. for me, I'm a spiritual person. I believe in God, and so I used to pray all the time. I used to, seek guidance from people that I knew from the outside. Family members who are spiritual people as well, who prayed for me every day. It was all that combined that really, really helped me stay on, the right track. It was so hard. And then when I finally made it to the gate, when I finally, had made it through all of that and, getting out and getting released. I mean, and like I said, it was just an incredible sense of joy. Transitioning to the outside world was, um, it wasn't as difficult for me as it might have been for other people because I had done so much, thinking about what I wanted to do once I got out and how I wanted to live my life so that, when I was finally here, it didn't seem foreign to me because I had thought about it. I thought about what it was going to feel like to, get on BART for the first time and take BART. And, I thought about these kind of things, situations, what it's going to be like to go to the grocery store and finally have the ability to choose what I want to eat. I thought about that, and I thought about it so much that once I was actually here doing it, it felt like second nature to me. So it really wasn't that tough for me to do. It really wasn't that big of a deal for me. I didn't, it just felt natural. Um, and obviously, I had a ton of support in that as well too. I wasn't by myself. I had created this support system for myself when I was on the inside so that when I did get out, if I had a question or if I, was feeling uncertain about something else, then I had somebody that was a phone call away that I could talk to about what I was going through to help me solve those minor problems that I was having. And that was super important for me. And I think it's super important for anyone that's leaving the incarcerated setting for any amount of time, is to have that support system for you to help you. Uh, like I said, I had a support system for myself. The last mile has been a huge part of that. Chris Redlitz has been somebody that has been both he and Beverly and the other graduates of the last mile have been there for me to help guide me, through whatever I might be going through out here. So that's been a huge part of my successful reentry. And it's something that I try to share with other graduates of the last mile and other guys that I know that have gotten out that aren't even part of the last mile, but might need, support too. It's a big deal. It really, really is.
So tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. I mean, I got a chance to watch your TED Talk, but our listeners don't know. And then another question that comes from that are, what are the life lessons from the inside that you apply on the outside to the work that you do in the life that you live?
Well, to the first part of your question, what I'm doing now is obviously I still work with the Last Mile. I'm on the board of directors for the Last Mile, and I'm also an evangelist for the organization. So I do a lot of talks in different places. You mentioned the TED Talk. That was one. I've done a number of different talks at different places to share not only my experience, but what we're doing with the Last Mile and how it's helping people now and how we think it can help people in the future. So that's been a huge part of my life since I've been home. I work at a technology campus called Rocket Space, which is in essence really like a hotel for tech startups. We provide an ecosystem for startup companies to help them grow their companies and become successful. I'm the manager of campus services at our San Francisco location, and I basically manage the physical infrastructure of the campus. And so I deal with a lot of contractors, a lot of vendors, and obviously our members who are here on campus and help them so that, help provide all of their needs while they're here on our campus so that they can focus on growing their companies. And so I've been here at Rocket Space for going on 3 years. In July, it'll be 3 years. I started at the company about 2 weeks after my release from prison. I met the founder and CEO of Rocket Space, Duncan Logan, through my participation in the Last Mile. Duncan is friends and business associates with a business associate of Chris Redlitz and Beverly Parenti. And Duncan was brought into San Quentin to be a mentor for myself and the other members of the Last Mile. And after our demo day, which is the graduation ceremony for the Last Mile grads, I approached Mr. Logan and just, asked him straight up, when I get out, would you consider giving me a job? And he said yes. And so this was probably about a year before I got out. When I did get out in 2013, I contacted Duncan through Chris, and he held true to his word. 2 weeks after I was released, I started as an intern. He gave me an internship at Rocket Space. And I entered the internship with the mindset that, I'm entering this tech world and I don't have a degree, in computer science and business management. I don't have any of that. But what I do have is a really strong work ethic. That's one of the things that I developed when I was on the inside. And, I entered Rocket Space with the mindset that, I'm going to do whatever it takes. I'm going to do whatever it takes to be part of this team and to help move this company forward. And I don't care if I have to, show up early and leave late, work weekends. If I have to make coffee and dump trash and scrape gum off the floor, then I'm going to be the best coffee making, trash dumping, gum scraping person that they've ever seen. And so I entered, Rocket Space with that mentality. And, through hard work and dedication over the last 3 years, I've been able to work my way up from being an intern to being the manager of campus services that I am today here.
Well, I can see what Chris referred you to me. This has been just riveting and fascinating. So I have one last question for you, which is how we finish all our interviews at the Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Wow, that's a great question. I think what makes somebody unmistakable is their desire to exceed all expectations, even their own. I think what makes somebody unmistakable is their desire to be the best person that they could be, to be the best at whatever it is. The person who's willing to take risks, legal risks, of course, and stay outside of that comfort zone and constantly develop, constantly try to grow, constantly reaching out for help when they need it, and be somebody that's genuine and authentic, and somebody that's just completely committed and driven to achieve their goals and to help others. I think those are key ingredients of somebody that's unmistakable.
Awesome. Well, Kenyatta, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your story and your insights with our listeners. This has just been such a mind-blowingly cool conversation.
Well, I thank you for having me, and I really appreciate, your support of our program. And to the listeners out there, there are a lot of people who are leaving incarcerated settings, and there are a lot of people who've made the necessary changes that they need to make. And I feel like, they need our support. And so if you have the opportunity to help somebody, please do. Everybody that's leaving an incarcerated setting isn't coming out ready, or thinking about committing another crime. I know that there's a lot of stigma associated with, with ex-felons and, people who are leaving jails and prisons, but they're people, and people have redeemable qualities. And, if people are given an opportunity to do better, they can and will do better. And so, I just encourage everybody out there to think about that and to do something to help the next man or woman.
Well, I think that makes a really just fitting and poetic way to wrap up our conversation. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Next time on The Unmistakable Creative.
Support is one of the big, in my courses on leadership, support is as a leader, that's one of the most valuable things you can provide for people. And I know you're talking about it being on the receiving end of support, but for me, what I can do for myself and my students and my clients is to be able to give them the ability to support people more effectively. And when you support someone, the loyalty that you get, the appreciation that you get, the dedication that you get is so great. And so many people think of leadership as like, you telling people what to do, and they don't realize how much work support takes. But also, it's not just work, meaning like you burning calories or burning the midnight oil. But I mean, like, you have to put the other person's interest before your own. You have to figure out what is hard for them, what's easy for them. You have to empathize with them. You have to have compassion. And if you do that effectively, then you never have to worry about micromanaging, because it doesn't happen if you do it effectively.
Professor, author, and entrepreneur Josh Spodek joins us to talk about the art of hustling.